Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Hardcore Soft Skills Podcast. My name is Yadi Caro, and in each episode, we'll learn a new skill with the help of an expert. If this is your first time listening from one of the 60 plus countries who listen to us this week, welcome. After this episode, you will learn specific techniques to help you become better at a particular skill. And if you sign up via hardcoresoftsskillspodcast.com now, you will get more and find out about upcoming events. In this episode, we welcome back Dr. Richard Orbe Austin. Dr. Orbe Austin is a psychologist, executive coach, organizational consultant, and a speaker. Dr. Orbe Austin and his partner, Dr. Lisa Orbe Austin, co-wrote the books Own Your Greatness, Overcome Imposter Syndrome, Beat Self-Doubt, and Succeed in Life, and the latest book, Your Unstoppable Greatness, Break Free of Imposter Syndrome, Cultivate Your Agency, and Achieve Your Ultimate Career Goals. In the previous episode, we talked about confidence and specifically imposter syndrome. At some point in our lives, we may have felt like we were just not cut for a role. But what if this is truly just our own imagination? And what if, because of this, we are living in constant burnout, codependency, and we fail to achieve our potential? Also, what if that micromanaging boss is also suffering from imposter syndrome? In this episode, we delve even deeper into this topic and give you more ways to address this and earn your confidence. Let's listen. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Orbe Austin, for being here with me in the podcast today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm so excited to be back. I had such a great time the first time we chatted.
Me too. And as I was chatting earlier, that I took the book, the new book, Your Unstoppable Greatness, with me while I was on vacation. And I was it's great because I love the fact that it's a workbook. So I just started making a bunch of notes and things. I've been working on this. So I have a lot of questions for you today.
I'm ready to jump into it.
Yes, and well, first of all, because you co-wrote this book with Dr. Lisa Orbe Austin, and she and basically what you both the same with the previous book, Own Your Greatness, and why did you both decided that you wanted to create this book?
And one of the things that I think is so helpful and so exciting about this opportunity, as you said, is we wanted to create something that was tangible and actionable. And so with Own Your Greatness and also now with Your Unstoppable Greatness, we wanted it to be a workbook. So we want people to write in it. We want people to bend pages. We want people to really take the next steps in transforming their lives. And so the way that this new book came about is that after Own Your Greatness, which came out in 2020, we saw great success with people reducing their imposter syndrome, really feeling like they were able to pursue their dreams, really being able to feel like they are on a path to their greatness. But what we also saw is that when they went into particular systems that were toxic, they would continually be triggered and really felt like, okay, they had the tools. They knew they weren't an imposter, but they still felt pulled to overwork, to be perfectionistic, to work towards the point of burnout. And so what we realized is that we needed a companion book, in essence, to talk about how to deal with toxic systems, how to protect your dreams in the midst of these types of systems in order to continue to conquer imposter syndrome and to pursue your dream.
That's wonderful, because as we do in this podcast is that we address a lot of different skills, thinking about developing our own confidence and eradicating that imposter syndrome. So you mentioned that in the previous book, there's a lot of tools that you provide, but there are still, even with having those tools, it seems that it's very difficult for us to have that. We still have that imposter syndrome. So what are some of those triggers that you refer to?
So one of the things that we talk a great deal about is this notion of toxic leaders. And so if you have what we call a prove it to me leader, that no matter what you do, they always make you feel like, okay, you have to prove that you belong here. You have to prove that that last project in which you achieved was not a fluke. And so every particular project feels like an audition for you. And you constantly then become triggered to feel like, oh, well, I know I'm not a fraud, but now he's telling me I need to continue to prove myself. So am I good enough? And so that becomes a trigger time and again.
I really was interested in the fact that you talk a lot about family dynamics and how
Mm-hmm.
our families can be a trigger for that, of how our backgrounds in terms of how we grew up kind of could feed that imposter syndrome. Could you talk about that?
Sure. So oftentimes when we're talking about imposter syndrome, this notion of feeling like a fraud, people may feel like, well, how does it happen? What causes it? And there was a great deal out in the popular media about oppression causing imposter syndrome. And what we talk about and what the research shows is that oppression benefits from it. Toxic systems benefit from it, but they're not the root causes of it. That oftentimes it's these early childhood experiences and the roles that we're given in our families that really cause or contribute to the imposter syndrome. So, for instance, you were identified as the smart one, the one that you felt knew everything. And even though your other siblings or other people in the family were just as smart, there was this pressure to feel like I needed to maintain that role. And so if you, for whatever reason, met adversity and did not feel perfect or did not do well, then you start to feel like, well, maybe I am a fraud. Maybe I'm not as smart as I think I am. And maybe it was, foolish for me to believe that all along. And so now I must stave off this whole notion of being a fraud. And so when you go into the world of work and you have a leader that taps into that feeling of, okay, show me that you're smart, I don't believe it, then you continue to feel like, okay, I thought I was a smart one, but no longer I have to demonstrate that I'm good enough.
Interesting. You also addressed earlier talking about burnout, because we still feel the need to work because we feel work a lot, I guess, because
Hmm.
we want to either prove something or we presume that we are just trying to show our how effective we can be.
So this is a great question because when we talk about burnout, sometimes people only feel like burnout is about being very, very exhausted. And that's
Mhm.
one part of it. But the other two pieces that we talk about is feeling emotionally distant from work, like feeling no longer as motivated to do the work that you used to enjoy, feeling disconnected, feeling cynical. And then the other piece of it tied to it is you're no longer feeling as effective in the role as you typically did. So, for instance, you might feel like, oh, it takes me this amount of time to do a project. Now it takes me longer because one, I don't feel as motivated, and two, I don't feel as effective. So I continue to overwork to compensate for that.
Yeah, and in terms of the being able to recover from or really solidify our confidence and getting rid of that imposter syndrome, you talk in the book about the 3 A's, that kind of the or framework.
Hmm.
You talk about the three agency and also about assessment and actualization. Could you talk about
Hmm.
that in terms of kind of the overall framework that you provide for eradicating imposter syndrome?
Sure. And so when we thought about these 3 A's, that first A, agency, oftentimes when we have imposter syndrome, we're dealing with it. We feel like we have no agency. We feel like we have no power in really being able to transform our lives, that we are just lucky to have a job, that we feel like someone's going to find us out. So let's just put our heads down and work. And so when we talk about agency in this context, we're talking about helping you to really think about what your dream is. And oftentimes, when we have imposter syndrome, we don't have a room to even dream. We're just trying to survive. And so, when we talk about this, we're saying we want you to be able to build space to envision or re envision the dream. And then, once you have that, how do you protect it? Because, as we said, these toxic systems want you to overwork, want you to not have any boundaries, to be
Mm.
24/7 accessible. And so that piece of the puzzle, once you gain that sense of agency, then you feel like you have a particular level of power to determine your way forward. And then we look at assessment. Then you, as we said, we all operate in systems. And when
Mhm.
we're looking at assessment, we're trying to figure out, well, what are these toxic types of leaders that we need to be conscious of or cognizant of and look out for? How do we identify some of these toxic work cultures that access us and tell us we need to be available 24/7 or we need to prove ourselves or we need to have no boundaries? So once you do that assessment, it really allows you to feel like I can have a healthy work life. I can make sure that if I see toxicity, that I can either transition out or try to counter it by building,
Mhm.
allyship in that way. And then finally, actualization is at the end of the day, really thinking about what is it like to be in a healthy environment? What is it like to be a healthy leader? Even if you're still struggling with imposter syndrome, how do you model the ways to be a healthy leader, to not micromanage, to not necessarily beat up people when they make mistakes, to not go so overboard when you feel like you're not perfect? And so that you walk away with this understanding through the 3 A's that it is possible to live a different and better life for yourself.
I want to delve more into the concept of the leaders who were um, those leaders who actually have imposter syndrome. And even myself, when I occupied years ago a position in management, I felt and I had that particular the micromanaging failure and
Hmm.
thinking along the lines of anything that you guys do will be a reflection on me, and therefore,
Hmm.
so how could you talk about the types of toxic leaders um, who do have who could show some signs that have an imposter syndrome?
Yeah, and you hit upon something so critical, right? And so when we talk about some of these toxic leaders, we talk about this insecure leader that feels like if my employees make a mistake, it's a reflection of me,
Hmm.
because then people will say that I'm a poor leader and I don't know what I'm doing. And so when we think about some of those leaders who are dealing with imposter syndrome, one of the things that we see is either one, they don't want to delegate because they feel like they can't trust anyone else, because they will be exposed to the fraud if someone is representing them. So they don't delegate and they end up overworking. They also, when a mistake is made because they're perfectionistic, tend to either not be able to tolerate it and either beat themselves up or beat up the person who actually makes the mistake, rather than saying, hey, let's learn from this, let's have a growth mindset. They really take it to this level of making everyone feel like it's the worst thing that can happen. They tend to, as we said, micromanage because they don't, again, trust that people can do the things that they need to do without them being there watching over them, because they're afraid that if a mistake is made, they will be exposed as the fraud. They don't tend to allow people to take breaks. They overwork individuals. They feel like work is the only way for them to demonstrate that they are good enough. And oftentimes, unfortunately, many leaders are not trained to be managers or to be leaders, right? And so you step into this role and there is some normal and natural insecurity because it may be the first time you're doing it. And when you
Hmm.
have imposter syndrome, it feels even more risky for you and threatening, rather than saying, hey, here's what I'm struggling with. How do I get some coaching? How do I get some support? They tend to do these types of leadership pitfalls that cause them to not necessarily be seen as great leaders.
Yeah. And if in the position of leaders and managers, how can we foster more confidence in our team, and how can we be less um, ensure that the people in our team do not suffer from imposter syndrome as well?
I think you want to be able to model healthy behavior. And so, one of the first things that we talk about is if you are struggling with imposter syndrome, being able to share that and saying that one of the things that I struggle with is feeling like I'm a fraud, but I understand that there are ways to overcome this. And so, I'm working on that. So, it opens up a dialogue to help your team members also say, huh, this is something that I struggle with too, and it's all right. It's normal. That unfortunately, many people with imposter syndrome suffer in silence because they're afraid they're going to be ridiculed, that people won't understand them, and so they end up not seeking support or getting the help that they need. And so, as a leader, modeling the behaviors of how do I demonstrate that I have boundaries, that I don't necessarily send emails all hours of the day, weekends when I'm on vacation, that when I take a vacation, I'm on vacation, and that I respect people's boundaries so that they're able to do the things they need to do for themselves, their family, their communities. Ultimately, people are always, and oftentimes I talk about this, people are always watching you as a leader. So it's not only what you say, but necessarily also what you do. And the more you're able to model these healthy behaviors, the more people will say, oh, well, this is something that's all right for me to do. It's all right for me to take a vacation. It's all right for me not to answer emails at 10 o'clock at night or on the weekends. And I can live a different life.
Yeah, and as part of the toolbox that you provide in the book, is you talk about the need for us to build a dream team. And I thought that was a very interesting concept because it's not just about us finding the confidence in ourselves and doing all these different actions. So, what is the dream team and how can it help us eradicate our imposter syndrome?
Sure. So when we talk about a dream team, we initially talked about this concept in the first book on your greatness and extended it now to your unstoppable greatness. The dream team is a group of supporters that will enable you, one, to really address your imposter syndrome. And so that can consist of a variety of different members. So a mentor or mentors, rather than having one person, someone who you can really seek guidance from, someone who will support you, someone who will allow you to really talk through some of the challenges that you face. Then there's someone like a cheerleader, someone no matter what is happening, you know, you can go to for emotional support. It will give you that sincere lift that you need emotionally. And then there's the action planner, someone who you can turn to really strategize. If you're meeting some level of a challenge, they are the person you turn to and they say, okay, let's get to work to think about what you need, either to
Mhm.
transition or to get a new job or to get a promotion. Then you have the grounder. When something happens, someone who is able to say it's not as bad as you may believe it to be, allows you to settle back into an emotional balance in that way. And then the imposter expert, like someone who is really well trained or understands imposter syndrome and how it operates and how it may show up for you, and allows you to think about strategies to overcome it. So that dream team is so critical because, as I've talked about before, people who have imposter syndrome tend to be lone, kind of like people who don't really want to talk about any of this, that they
Mhm.
suffer in silence, they don't seek
Yeah.
the help that they need, and then they end up not being able to get the help that they deserve. You know, your podcast is focused on really skills building. This notion of conflict management is such a critical aspect. Oftentimes, again, people with imposter syndrome tend to be people pleasers, that they don't necessarily want people to be upset with them because they believe that if that happens, they will have less of an ability to fool them, quote unquote, to not be exposed as a fraud. And so when
Mhm.
you're in a toxic environment, especially if you have a particular leader who is telling you to do things like to overwork, like to not have no boundaries, and you wish to push back, you may feel like, well, I don't have the room or the right to do so. But recognizing that conflict can actually be a healthy and positive thing. It may not feel good, right?
Mhm.
Like, I don't think
Mhm.
anyone jumps in and says, I want to have conflict today. I'm so excited about it.
There
But
might
to
be
be
some.
able, right, yeah, there are some actually, but you know, for the most part, healthy people really saying it doesn't feel good, but it's important because it allows me to make sure that I'm seen and I'm heard, my needs are met, so that I don't feel like I am totally overrun by things that are not going to be healthy for me. So that conflict management skill, being able to confront a particular person or particular situation, is so key to being able to ensure that you can manage in a toxic environment.
Other skills would you consider important that we need to build in order to help us gain more confidence?
So I would say communication skills are so critical. Communication and interpersonal skills, understanding how to engage with different people and difficult people. That oftentimes we may feel like the way to succeed is to put our heads down and to
Mhm.
just work. And someone will tap us on the shoulder and say, okay, you're good. We'll move you forward. But we know that in many situations that is not the case. That you need to be able to connect with people, you need to be able to build relationships with people, you need to be able to express yourself in ways that allow people to understand who you are. I
Yeah.
oftentimes talk about this with introverted clients where I'm not suggesting that you are someone that you need to be someone different, right? We live in an extroverted society. It does not mean that an introvert cannot thrive. And the
Mhm.
way to thrive is to stretch yourself a bit and to say, I know that I don't necessarily like to be in an office around people, keeping my door open, but maybe I will go out for a moment and say, hey, how was the weekend? Like, here's what I did. How do I make sure that people see me? And so being able to recognize those key skills, communication, interpersonal skills, problem solve. Like when you hit a particular a situation that feels like there is no way forward, being able to take some time to take a step back and think about some solutions is critical to being able to thrive and do the things that you can do to achieve your goals.
Yeah. Since the publication, or from the previous book to the current book, or overall in your particular research, um, how has there been any changes in terms of how this imposter syndrome manifests in us as individuals, as the workplace has changed? So, have you seen any particular changes?
Sure. So the first book was published right in the midst and launch of the pandemic, right? Like we were
Mm-hmm.
very excited to be able to have a book tour or what have you. And it came
Yeah.
out April of 2020.
Wow.
And we had no understanding of what remote work would look like. And then what we found over that time period are that people who have imposter syndrome really struggled with remote work because they tended
Mm.
to overwork. Like oftentimes people felt like, oh, remote work, you're in your pajamas, you're not doing much of anything. But the reality is that most people, even those who didn't have imposter syndrome, ended up working more hours, not less. But those
Yeah.
with imposter syndrome tended to overwork even more because they felt like, well, I definitely have to prove that I'm good enough because my boss can't see me all the time. And
Mhm.
I then need to be able to demonstrate to them that I'm either online all hours of the night or I'm responding to emails all hours of the night. So that's why you saw this level of burnout rise and continue to be high based on some of the dynamics of the pandemic and how we work nowadays.
In terms of minorities, or us as minorities, and how does that imposter syndrome look like for minorities? Is it more
Mhm.
significant?
Sure. So we talk about what we call the double impact of imposter syndrome for those historically marginalized individuals. So what I mean by that is internally you feel like an imposter, and then externally there are signals in the environment through discrimination and bias who are telling you that you're an imposter, right? And that you don't belong, that you shouldn't be here, that you are a diversity hire, or that you were lucky to have this job. And so when we talk about the fact that, yes, oppression does not cause actual imposter syndrome, but it sustains it and it
Mm,
benefits from it. Because when you're from a marginalized community and someone is saying to you, oh, you're a diversity hire, so I know that's the
mm,
reason you are here. If you're dealing with imposter syndrome, then you feel like, okay, now I need to prove that I am, that I belong here, right? That I was not just given this because of my background. And so that double impact causes a certain level of pressure, causes anxiety, causes stress in ways that those from a more privileged background may not experience.
interesting. And now that, since you mentioned that too, I was talking with a friend the other day, and she was mentioning, as she is member of a Hispanic minority group. Um, what are your thoughts when it comes to organizations doing specific groups for minorities? Say, if my friend is a member of like a leadership group, that they have specific training for minorities. And I was thinking, is that good because they're kind of separated as minorities, or is that a bad thing? What are the particular thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is also an excellent question because there are many organizations that came to believe, okay, we need to do these affinity type groups to give, historically marginalized people an opportunity to excel. If in fact what happens in those particular groups facilitates the same level of opportunities and growth projects and paths than others, then that's great. But if it's, oh, okay, we're going to do this thing for this group and, we'll give them some training, but it doesn't advance them, it doesn't
Mm,
allow them to actually grow and to build, I think that that's the concern because we do need to be mindful of that there are different experiences based on our backgrounds that we may have in the world of work. And so having some level of cultural competence about that, having an opportunity to share with those who may have similar experiences is always useful. But what I found, unfortunately, in some of these leadership programs, they do not lead to actual leadership opportunities.
Mm.
But the organization gets to say, oh, look at this program that I have for these marginalized communities. We're doing so much for them, and we've gotten all these graduates. But then when you look at the top tiers of the organization, there is no change and there is no diversity. And so that's where the challenge is how do you then ensure that these programs actually benefit the participants in all ways relative to their career opportunities?
Very interesting. Okay, that they bring actually all the opportunities needed in equal level. Before we go, the if we have somebody listening right now and they still think, okay, I have imposter syndrome, no matter what you tell me, doctor, I want to go ahead. I am not, I know I'm not good at my job. I know that I feel that way. What would you recommend are a couple of key steps to get started to convince us that, hey, no, you're not an imposter. You actually are good. You just need to work these things. What are some key steps for that?
Well, one of the things that I oftentimes talk about is this notion of how do you craft the narrative of who you are. Like we all carry a narrative of ourselves, like who we tell ourselves we are in the world. And so if your narrative, especially when you have imposter syndrome, is, well, I'm just lucky to have this job. I don't really have any skills. People felt sorry for me, and it's because I was nice. Being able to change that narrative is a key start of saying, no, am I perfect? No, but I do have skills, that there's a reason that I am here, that it's not just luck. Some of it may be luck. I will not dismiss that piece of it, but it's not luck alone for you to really be able to be successful in the ways that you are successful. So being able to identify those skill sets, those accomplishments. And if you're finding it difficult to do that, talk to those who know you best, right? Your mentors, your family members, your friends. And oftentimes when we ask those people, especially when we have imposter syndrome, we may dismiss it and say, oh, because they know me, they like me, they're going to say the nice. Believe them. Be able to tolerate that they are not lying to you to feel good. They are telling you the truth. And so the more you're able to really embrace the true narrative of who you are, not this false narrative that imposter syndrome tells you that you're lucky, that you're going to be a fraud, the easier it is for you to then conquer imposter syndrome and to live that full life and best life that you wish to live.
Great advice. And thank you so much, Dr. Orbe Austin, for being here with me again today. I highly enjoyed the book, and it gave me so many different perspectives and things to work on as well, because I guess this is a constant work that we have to do in terms of working on our confidence. I appreciate your time. What's the best way for people to contact you?
So the best ways to contact me is to either look at my website, dynamictransitionsllp.com. And then I'm also very much active on Instagram. So it's at Dr. Rich Orbe Austin, where I will talk a lot about toxic systems, imposter syndrome, diversity, equity, inclusion. Those are some of the best ways to really reach out to me, see my work, kind of engage with me. I'm very much love to connect with those who are reading the book, responding to the book, or have questions about any of what we've talked about today.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening today. Before you leave, make sure you go to my website, hardcoresoftskillspodcast.com, and sign up for my weekly newsletter. Then go to the review tab and leave a review. It is the way to ensure this podcast is discovered by others. Remember that by learning soft skills, you make your hard skills work for you. See you next time.